The autumn wind rolled across the endless plains of Montana Territory in 1882, carrying with it the scent of dry grass, pine trees, and distant rain. To most people the land looked empty. To Ethan Carter it looked like possibility. At 34 years old, Ethan had spent nearly a decade turning 160 acres of rough frontier into a respectable cattle ranch. Every fence post had been set by his own hands. Every log in the cabin had been cut from the nearby forest. The stone chimney stood straight because he had rebuilt it 3 times before he was satisfied. His neighbors often joked that Ethan trusted a hammer more than conversation. Perhaps they were right. He wasn't unfriendly. He simply believed words mattered too much to waste. If he made a promise, he intended to keep it. If he gave advice, it came only after careful thought. That habit made him dependable but also lonely. One cool October evening, Ethan sat alone on his porch watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. Beside him rested an empty rocking chair he had built months earlier. His closest neighbor, Samuel Brooks, rode over just as the sky turned orange. Samuel climbed off his horse and laughed. "You know," he said, pointing toward the empty chair, "I've been meaning to ask why you've got 2 rocking chairs when only one of them ever gets used." Ethan smiled faintly. "I suppose I built the second one for someone who hasn't arrived yet." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That's a mighty expensive way to hope." "Hope isn't expensive," Ethan replied. "Giving up is." Samuel chuckled, though he noticed Ethan wasn't joking. "You planning to wait forever?" "No." "Then what's your plan?" Ethan looked across the valley before answering. "I'm going to write 1 letter." 3 weeks later, a small advertisement appeared in the matrimonial column of a regional newspaper. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise wealth or adventure. It simply read, "Montana ranch owner, age 34, seeks an honest woman interested in building a peaceful life rather than chasing excitement. My home is simple, my land is growing, and there is always room for another place at my table. If kindness matters more to you than appearances, perhaps we should write to one another." Dozens of replies arrived over the next month. Some spoke only of money. Others wanted photographs before exchanging another letter. A few seemed more interested in owning land than knowing the man who lived on it. Ethan thanked each person politely but never wrote again. Then one snowy afternoon, another envelope appeared. The handwriting was neat but confident. The return address read, "Miss Margaret Ellis, Concord, Massachusetts." Inside was a 4-page letter. It began without unnecessary compliments. "Mr. Carter, I cannot promise that we would suit one another, but I can promise honesty. I am 29 years old and have worked as a schoolteacher since I was 19. I have never cared much for crowded cities. I enjoy books, long walks, quiet mornings, and people who speak only when they have something worth saying." Ethan smiled. He continued reading. "My mother often says I think too much before making decisions. She is probably correct. That is why I waited 2 days before answering your advertisement. I do not know whether I belong in Montana. I only know I no longer belong here." There was something different about her words. They didn't try to impress. They simply told the truth. For the first time since placing the advertisement, Ethan folded a letter carefully instead of tossing it into the drawer. That evening he lit another lantern and began writing. Their correspondence quickly became unlike anything either of them had expected. Instead of asking shallow questions, they discussed ideas. Margaret asked what silence sounded like on the prairie. Ethan described mornings when frost covered the fields so completely that the entire valley looked carved from glass. Ethan asked why she loved teaching. Margaret replied, "Because every child deserves one adult who believes they can become more than the world expects." She asked whether he ever grew lonely. He answered honestly, "Every winter." She asked whether he was afraid. "Sometimes." "Of what?" "Building a good life with no one to share it." Weeks turned into months. Letters grew longer. 5 pages became 8. 8 became 12. Neither realized how much they looked forward to the next envelope until one failed to arrive on schedule. For 3 extra days Ethan found himself checking the mailbox before breakfast. Samuel noticed. "You waiting on supplies?" "No." "Cattle prices?" "No." Samuel grinned. "The teacher?" Ethan tried not to smile. "Perhaps. I've never seen a man nervous over paper before." "It isn't the paper." "No. It's the person holding the pen." Winter settled heavily across Montana. Snow buried the fences. The cattle stayed close to the barn. Most evenings Ethan spent by the fireplace reading Margaret's letters for a second or third time. One passage stayed with him. People spend too much of life pretending to be interesting. I'd rather be sincere. He copied the sentence into his notebook. Not because he wished to remember the words. Because he wished to remember the woman who had written them. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, Margaret found herself doing something equally unexpected. She began imagining the ranch. She pictured mountains she had never seen. The smell of pine. Fresh snow. A wooden porch overlooking open country. She wondered whether the stars truly looked brighter so far from the city. She wondered whether Ethan was exactly as calm in person as he seemed in writing. One evening her mother noticed her smiling while folding another letter. "Is he handsome?" her mother teased. Margaret laughed. "I honestly don't know." "Then why are you smiling?" "Because I think he's kind." Her mother nodded knowingly. "That matters longer." By early spring Ethan finally suggested they meet. He wrote carefully. "Miss Alice, letters have a way of making strangers feel familiar. Still, I believe people deserve the chance to know one another face to face. If you should ever decide to travel west, I would be honored to welcome you here." Margaret read the invitation 3 times. Her heart told her to leave immediately. Life had other plans. Only days later, her mother became seriously ill with pneumonia. The doctor insisted recovery would take months. Margaret could not leave. She sat at her desk for nearly an hour before writing her reply. "Mr. Carter, this is the most difficult letter I have written. My mother has fallen ill and I cannot leave while she depends on me. I do not know how long her recovery will take. It would be unfair to ask you to wait." The letter traveled more than 2,000 miles before reaching Montana. Ethan read every line twice. Then he quietly walked outside. Snowmelt trickled through the valley. Birds had begun returning. He stood beside the empty rocking chair for a long time. The next morning he answered. "Miss Alice, you apologized for circumstances beyond your control. Please don't. The sort of woman who stays beside her mother when she is needed is exactly the sort of woman worth waiting for. The mountains are not going anywhere. Neither is the empty chair." When Margaret unfolded his reply several days later, tears quietly filled her eyes. Not because he had promised forever, but because he had offered patience without asking for anything in return. For the first time in many years the future no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt farther away. And somehow that was enough. Nearly 11 months passed before another letter from Margaret Ellis arrived. By then, another winter had come and gone across the Montana plains. Ethan Carter had repaired fences, expanded his barn, and welcomed the spring calves into the world, but there had hardly been a day when he hadn't wondered whether the next mail delivery would carry her familiar handwriting. One warm April morning, the postmaster handed him a cream-colored envelope. Ethan recognized it before reading the name. He stood quietly beneath the porch roof before opening it. Inside was a single letter. "Dear Ethan, my mother has recovered well enough to insist that I stop worrying about her and begin living my own life. She says she has watched me smile at your letters for nearly a year and believes she already knows the sort of man you are. If your invitation still stands, I'm ready to come. I expect to arrive in Helena on the afternoon train May 18th. Margaret." For the first time in years Ethan laughed aloud with no one around to hear him. Samuel Brooks happened to ride past the ranch that afternoon. "You look different," Samuel said. "I received good news." Samuel grinned. "The teacher?" Ethan simply nodded. Samuel smiled wider. "I'd say it's about time that second rocking chair met its owner." The morning of May 18th arrived clear and bright. The mountains still held patches of snow, but wildflowers had begun covering the valleys. Ethan reached the railway station nearly an hour early. As passengers stepped off the train he searched each face. Then he saw her. Margaret wore a simple blue traveling dress and carried one leather suitcase that had clearly seen many miles. A straw hat shaded her eyes, but it couldn't hide the warmth in her smile. For a brief moment both of them simply stood there. It felt strangely familiar. Not because they had met before, but because months of honest letters had already introduced them. Margaret stepped closer. "So," she said softly, "you're exactly as I imagined." Ethan smiled. "I was about to say the same." She laughed. "I was afraid it might be awkward." "So was I." "It isn't." "No." He picked up her suitcase. "Welcome to Montana." The wagon ride back to the ranch took nearly 3 hours. Neither felt the need to fill every silence. Sometimes they simply admired the mountains. Sometimes Margaret asked questions about the rivers, the cattle, or the changing seasons. Other times they simply listened to birds singing across the open fields. As they reached the ranch, Ethan slowed the horses. There it is. Margaret looked toward the cabin. It was exactly as he had described. Strong log walls. A stone chimney. A wide front porch. 2 rocking chairs waiting side by side. She smiled without realizing it. So, Ethan asked carefully, "What do you think?" Margaret looked around the peaceful valley before answering. "I think your letters forgot to mention how beautiful home can look." The weeks that followed felt wonderfully ordinary. Margaret quickly learned ranch life. She helped organize supplies, balanced the ranch accounts, planted flowers near the porch, and filled the empty shelves with books she had brought from Massachusetts. Soon neighboring children began stopping by whenever their parents visited. Margaret noticed many of them struggled to read. One afternoon she gathered 5 children beneath a large cottonwood tree. She opened one of her books. "Who wants a story?" 5 hands shot into the air. Within a month, nearly 20 children came every Saturday afternoon. Parents began calling it Miss Ellis's Little School. Ethan watched proudly from a distance. "You've built something," he told her one evening. Margaret smiled. "So have you?" "No." He looked toward the children laughing outside. "I built fences. You built the place where they could gather." Summer brought difficult days. A terrible drought spread across much of the territory. Streams became smaller. Grass turned brown. Several neighboring ranchers lost cattle. Everyone worried. Ethan worked from sunrise until well after dark trying to protect his herd. Margaret refused to let him carry the burden alone. She kept careful records of water supplies. She suggested rotating grazing areas instead of using the same fields continuously. She even convinced neighboring families to share equipment instead of struggling separately. "It isn't only your ranch," she reminded them. "It's all of ours." The community listened. Together they survived the season better than anyone expected. Samuel later admitted, "I've lived here 15 years. I've never seen folks work together the way they did this summer." Ethan smiled. "Neither have I." That autumn, Ethan invited Margaret onto the porch after supper. The sunset painted the mountains gold. The familiar rocking chairs faced the endless prairie. For several minutes neither spoke. Finally Ethan reached into his pocket. He removed a small velvet box. "I've written hundreds of pages to you." Margaret smiled. "You have. But there are some things that deserve to be spoken instead." He opened the box. Inside rested a simple silver ring engraved with a tiny mountain and a single pine tree. "I built this ranch hoping someday it would become a home." He looked into her eyes. "It became one the day you arrived. Margaret Ellis. Would you stay beside me for the rest of our lives?" Tears filled her eyes before she answered, "Yes." There was never another answer. They were married 6 weeks later beneath the enormous cottonwood tree where Margaret had first gathered the neighborhood children. There were no expensive decorations. No grand ceremony. Neighbors brought homemade food. Children picked wildflowers. Samuel insisted on giving a speech that made everyone laugh. When the ceremony ended, Ethan and Margaret walked together onto the porch. Without speaking, they each sat in one of the rocking chairs. Samuel laughed from across the yard. "I've waited 2 years to see those chairs finally occupied." Everyone laughed with him. Years passed gently. The ranch prospered. Margaret's little school eventually became the town's first permanent classroom. Children she had once taught returned years later with families of their own. Many credited her for teaching them not only how to read, but how to believe in themselves. Ethan expanded the ranch little by little, never chasing wealth beyond what they truly needed. Together they planted hundreds of trees, built a larger barn, helped neighbors during difficult winters. And every evening, whenever work allowed, they returned to the porch. 2 rocking chairs. 1 quiet sunset. The same peaceful view. 43 years later, Ethan passed away peacefully at the age of 77. The entire valley attended his funeral. After everyone had gone home, Margaret sat alone on the porch. The evening wind moved gently across the prairie just as it had the day Ethan first built the ranch. While organizing his desk several weeks later, she discovered a worn leather journal she had never seen before. Inside were notes from nearly every year of their marriage. Near the final pages she found one short sentence written in careful handwriting. I once believed I built this house with my own hands. I was wrong. Wood built the walls. Love built the home. Margaret closed the journal slowly. She carried it outside. She settled into the rocking chair beside the empty one. The sunset stretched endlessly across the Montana sky. For a long time she simply listened to the wind. Then she smiled. People often believe that happiness arrives in dramatic moments. But the greatest blessings usually come quietly. In one honest letter. One patient promise. One journey across 1,000 miles. And one empty chair that someone at last chooses to fill. As darkness settled over the valley, the old ranch stood exactly as Ethan had always hoped it would, not merely as a house built of timber and stone, but as a home built on trust, patience, and two hearts that had found each other when they needed it most.